I'll say when.
Yes.
We are live, Beena.
Hello and welcome to Moreness-Culture. Good morning, Syl. Hope we will have soon rain also here. And I assume that Norma will be here. So hello, Norma, in advance. And
Oh,
Joseph will be here. So hello, Joseph. And some other people, of course. They are coming as a surprise, and new guests are also joining us. So today's thought, I will try my best to keep my eyes on the clock. Okay. Yes. So I start.
very good.
But
Just
okay,
practice.
anyway.
This is just practice.
Yes, yes,
There's no real need for it, but just for practice.
yes. Okay. So today's thought, just before coming here, we were in the discussion. We were just in discussion, busy, and I was sharing with Sil that how I was paying attention. It is not, again, please be very, very cautious of assuming that, oh, it is just like because I like his perspective, because I like his and I really admire his awareness and everything. So I'm impressed. That's why I'm doing that. No, again, it is my deliberate choice every single day. I choose to pay attention. I choose to think about things, what he's sharing, and of course,
Oh yeah.
anyone else
Oh yeah.
also,
Oh
they're
yeah.
sharing. So he shared something which was really interesting for me because I never heard anyone else saying that or having this perspective that I'm using procrastination is my motivation. It's
Well,
like,
the main topic was intent and motivation, and I mentioned this as a sort of just as part of that, kind of almost as an afterthought.
thank you for
Yeah.
the spoiler, Sil. Thank you so much for the
Oh,
spoiler.
sorry,
I was
sorry,
building up a
sorry, sorry.
suspense.
Oh, I didn't realize. Okay, sorry, sorry, sorry. Just ignore me, cancel, edit it out.
Anyway, so for me, that was really interesting when someone says that procrastination is my motivation. Or,
Yeah.
in other words, I use procrastination as motivation, to be precise. This was like, really? Who can actually think of something like that? But then I didn't ask him much at that time, and I just paid attention to, and I just keep, because every unresolved idea, perspective, thought, it just stays in my mind. I'm super, super determined in this.
Yes, yeah, same,
No matter
same.
how much time it is going to take, it sometimes it just took years. So that
Yeah,
was
no
just
matter.
sitting in my mind. And in the night and throughout my day, I was thinking about it. Why I'm sharing this, that do we have to be this scrupulous, or of course, even better than this,
Mm.
scrupulous when it comes to awareness. Awareness, enhancing our awareness has to be always in the forefront of our consciousness. It has to be our most important choice
Yeah.
in this world. It has to be always there. Once you start, at least this is happening from the me, once you start doing that, universe just start communicating with you amazingly in very unusual, unique ways. This is what is happening with me. So thank you so much, Sil. I'm going to just, okay, we at some point we are going to discuss this in more detail. Like, okay, what is and how you come up with this idea that using
Ah,
procrastination as a motivation. But you already
ah.
spoiled it, so no problem.
Oh, sorry. Well, I was just saying the bigger heading, we didn't go
I
directly to
knew,
that.
I
I
knew,
didn't
but
think
I
it
was
spoiled
saying,
anything. I think it added, but all right. All good.
no, no.
Good.
But
All good. Sorry.
it was good. It was good.
Yeah, yeah. It's a big discussion. Uh, you know, we'll hold on to it for a while because we still in the middle of it, and there's still lots of processing on it, right? It's still inside there,
Exactly.
and this is an important part of the process, is to process things. And yes, we've processed, we thought it through to the end, we've perspective shifted to multiple perspectives, but that's only a part of it. Then you've got to let it settle down inside of yourself. You let it assimilate and integrate and incorporate. Very specifically, that word, incorporate. Take it into your corporality, your body, right? This is very important. It must settle down and sink into your bones and tendons and everywhere into your body, right? And some things go into different places. Like I feel this particular point, it needs to go here somewhere. the elbow and on either side of it, right? That area. I don't, it just maybe me, but you'll see Don Juan has this, he brings this up later on, where we store things in different places in the body. I don't know, it's just a feeling, but it may be different for you. It makes no difference. But the fact is, when you feel it and it's settled into your body and you have that feeling, okay, I got this, I own this. Now you can use it. And it's very much tied into intent and motivation. When you make it your own and you make it physically that you feel, I own this, it's mine, it's part of my body, then you can leverage it for motivation. You can use it as motivation. You can use it as intent, right? You can just use it as a tool as well, right? But you can additionally use it as motivation also. Very, very powerful stuff. Nuanced, very sophisticated techniques for learning and growing, enhancing and developing awareness. And of course, it's not just to be aware, right? And in at least in the normal sense, I can be aware of motivation, for instance. I can be aware, like in this case, of procrastination. And then, after what I shared and Beena now shared, well, as a third party, I say, well, I can be aware that somebody is using procrastination as a motivator. Okay, people use all sorts of things for motivators. I get it. I understand. I'm aware of it. But in capital A awareness, I want to say, I want to be aware to the point that I can use it. Then in part of Way of Impeccability, I go the extra step, because Way of Impeccability is all about application, right? All those A's: appropriateness, attunement, awareness, and application. They all join in the mind map, right? Make that diamond up there. Now, this is very key. So now in application, I say, I want to own this ability to use procrastination as a motivation, right? And then I take it in and I do what I just described, right? That processing ability, absorbing it, integrating it, assimilating it, incorporating it into me. Then I actually go and test this, which is one of the reasons Beena went through. I mean, we've got a whole show on just this, which we'll probably do when we start doing our own show on this whole point, right? Because then Beena went and processed all the reasons why I could do this, and she came up with half a dozen at least. And she said, well, possibly one of the reasons why you would do this is to just test that he can. And that's important. Yeah. Yeah, very powerful, very powerful. Beena was just absolutely brilliant in her analysis, the section, discernment, figuring it out. Again, when we motivated, and when we motivated, particularly motivated by resolution, capital R, resolution, it is the most incredible motivation there is, because we get so much value out of it. We can be motivated to do things, right? Let's say we're motivated by ambition, typical ambition, right? Fame and success and approval and attention and all this. The thing that you actually get is a bit hollow, because, well, I'm getting all this attention from everybody else and all this, but it's a bit hollow. Why? Because, well, that's what I wanted. But now that I'm getting it, I realize, well, I'm actually kind of makes me vulnerable, because my happiness is dependent on somebody else. That's not such a great accomplishment, right? Yes, I've got the fame and all that, but it's hollow because it's dependent on others. No, I want to be happy because of me, not because of needing somebody else's attention. So this point of finding value is very, very important. And it's part of Way of Impeccability. I want to say hello to Casey Parsons for joining us on IG. Welcome, Casey Parsons. Good to see you here. Most excellent. Welcome to Moreness-Culture. This is what we do. We're sharing Moreness-Culture. Now, that's a huge topic. Why? Because it's not just a point. It's not just a topic. It is an alternative paradigm that we are talking about. Paradigm. That's completely different. Yeah. I was watching a TV series about the astronauts in the International Space Station and all the things that go on there. And it just is a nice example of the living in the space station is an alternative paradigm, right? Involves an alternative paradigm. And well, it's sort of obvious, okay? But we don't think of it. We don't think of gravity as being a paradigm, but it is, right? Now, of course, I'm talking about psychological paradigms, spiritual paradigm, belief paradigms, right? Awareness paradigms, and particularly belief paradigms. But that the physical fact of gravity affects everything, right? You just take things for granted. And there's one point, like the astronaut had been living in space for a long time, and she was holding a glass. I don't have a nice glass here. Well, I suppose I can use my hydrogenator. Anyway, so she's holding it, and she's back on Earth now. She's in her kitchen, and she just kind of puts it over here and lets go. And of course, the thing drops and breaks. Says, "Oh, I was just, she had become accustomed to doing that in space because she'd lived up there for a long time." Right? And we could just put something in it, it'll just float there. That's it, right? Different paradigm. So there's a lot of adjustment just because of gravity, right? And you've got to understand that, yes, you may have no gravity, but that doesn't mean that you don't have mass. In other words, if you start moving and you're moving towards the bulkhead and, you're floating and you're going head first, just because you have no weight being attracted down doesn't mean you have no mass. You're going to bang into that bulkhead with your head, and it's going to hurt, right? So you're not literally light like a feather, right? You still weigh the same. You just don't have gravity pulling on that weight. So simple adjustments, right? But the other thing, of course, is another paradigm shift there. In this, that you're out there and it's you and whoever's with you, and that's it. You don't have a connection like on Earth. You can phone people, call people, you can walk somewhere if you get into trouble, whatever. Right? You isolate, right? Well, very different paradigm too. Now you can be isolated on Earth too, and I've lived in an isolated place, and it's a shift. It's a shift. So when we understand paradigm shifting, it's a big deal because we have a cultural paradigm of the superiority paradigm, and it acts on us like gravity. We don't realize its force and influence. But when you don't have it anymore and you say, wow, there's an alternative. Wow, then you realize, oh my goodness, I've been pulled down, and it's like, right, the gravity that we have is useful and it's convenient, but the gravity of the superiority paradigm, that's like making you weigh tons, and it just wears you down, and it takes all your energy, and it's just terrible, right? So paradigm shifting is a very, very big deal. And that's what we're all about, right? All about paradigm shifting. Yeah, it's very powerful. And the Moreness-Culture paradigm, it's Moreness not in terms of wealth and quantity, but Moreness in terms of what is beneficial, what adds to us as individuals, what adds to our character, what adds to my learning and growing, what enhances and develops my awareness, what gives me greater abilities, greater competence, greater joy, greater happiness, particularly joy, right? We want to go beyond happiness. We want to go to superlatives. I just wrap them all up in joy. But whichever possible alternative, superlative of being there is, this is our endpoint, our goal, right? And we look to bring it now here, not as a theoretical thing, but as a practical day-to-day application. And of course, the core for Moreness-Culture is in Way-of-Impeccability, right? And Way-of-Impeccability, I don't need to go into detail what it is. The name is sufficient, right? The subtext, the subtitle for Way-of-Impeccability, it's a program that we can do, and I have had many participants do. But it is it's a toolbox for deliberate living, right? And so it enhances you. It's a character training program, and it is a fine-tuning program, and it does lots of wonderful things, right? And it's tools. It's a toolbox for deliberate living. Because when we can live deliberately, that's when you have joy. That's when you have power. That's when you have moreness, right? Moreness in the sense that we mean moreness, right? Not moreness in terms of, well, I got a Ferrari now. That's moreness. Well, that could be a part of it, but not necessarily, right? It's living in attunement. When you live in attunement, everything is right, capital R, right, not right in a moralistic sense, but right in that absolutely appropriate. This is a fantastic way to live, absolutely incredible way to live. Massive moreness to it. Now, living in attunement and doing everything via attunement, and attunement as a motivator. This is a very, very big topic, and we are going to be paying attention to this. Why? Because we are the greater thread of these lives that we are doing is that we are reading Carlos Castaneda's books with the intent of doing a capital R reading of them. And a capital R reading is about discernment, looking at the layers, looking at the depth, connecting to the extra, extracting value, applying that value, etc. Right? So it's all about extracting that moreness, connecting to that moreness, creating moreness from whatever we're reading. This is a big, big deal. Now, in our capital R reading, we are reading Don Juan. Carlos, he plays the fool in this book, right? Whether it's deliberate or that's how he was, doesn't matter. But Carlos is a knucklehead, and that's just the way the whole thing goes. But Don Juan shares a lot of profound value. Yes? And it's not necessarily all of it unique to Don Juan. Be aware of this, as some people think when you encounter it. If you haven't encountered anything else, I've done a great study of everything else, and I can tell you this is from here and this is from there, or it's also there. It may be originated and reinventing the world, because that happens in different parts of the world. People come up with the same sensibilities because there are sensibilities, especially when there's self-evident sensibility. If you think about it, you're going to get there, right? I know me, I've reinvented the wheel many times. Like when I was a teenager, I was in a bubble of my own, culturally isolated, as it were, in terms of what I was doing, which was this, learning and growing, developing stuff, right? And when I later started reading, this my development of a psychology and my philosophy of being, my application, development of strategy, all of that stuff, I figured it out for myself. When I later started reading, oh, okay. And I started seeing what I'd figured out, and I realized, well, I reinvented the wheel. Okay, it's great. It's confirmation that you're at least on the right track. Sometimes there's stuff that I haven't seen that was unique to me, but so be it. That's the magic of when you have this intent to learn and grow. And when your intent is to learn and grow, and the intent is specifically also to enhance and develop awareness, it's an incredible motivator. An incredible motivator. It's kept me going all my life, still does. Fantastic stuff. Fantastic stuff. All right, let's continue with our reading. We started, and then
Yes.
We had technical issues. Well, it was not ours, but the internet, and Zoom had a problem, and it wasn't working, and it just cut us off, and it just dropped us. And then we weren't able to come back yesterday either. So there must have been some update. Like yesterday, we were not able to do a live, right? It just didn't allow us to do that. I must share specifically. So it's very interesting how sometimes, I think what happens is because we are streaming to Facebook and YouTube and Instagram all at the same time, all live together. And I think one of them had an update and the others hadn't had time to match it yet. And so then things weren't working properly. But it's all working fine today. So it was fun yesterday. We just chilled and relaxed, and it was all good. And we had that wonderful conversation, which, that's why we like doing the lives, because the lives make time for us to have those conversations. Because we got other things that we do together. We have, we got a business that we do together as well, which just, pays the bill while we do this wonderful stuff. And at some point, this will be our livelihood. But in the meantime, we got to, it takes time. We always, our day, we get together and on Zoom or on any kind of communications, and we really discuss matters that are important to us from a learning and growing point of view. And that's why we do the lives, right? Because if we don't, then the business stuff tends to squish that time and take it away a bit, right? And minimize it. But now we're making a specific time. So we get into all of these things, and it's a great joy, right? It's a great joy. Right, Beena? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. I just want to say, I don't want to just assume on your behalf, but it's a great joy for me. All right. You want to read, Beena? Oh, so look, I had this, all the books saved in a copied and pasted and made my own file. but this then the formatting is a bit broken in my file, right? But now with this, oh, I hope can you see it, Beena? Is it, or which one are you seeing? I hope this has got picked up the right one now.
Yes.
In the screen share. It doesn't have that broken formatting, right? Is that what you're seeing?
No. Yes, it is. It is okay.
It's good. It's a new one, right?
Yes.
All right. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm going to read. Okay.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll read too, but you know, I like when you read. It's good. It's
Okay.
good practice.
Chapter 8. My okay. My last encounter with Nascalito was a cluster of four sessions which took place within 4 consecutive days. So one call this long session method. Method.
I think metote. I would
Yes,
imagine.
metote. Okay, session of metote. It was a purity ceremony for Pioteros, okay, and apprentices.
Peyoteros. Yeah.
Pioteros and apprentices. There were 2 older men about on Juan's age, one of whom was the leader. The 5 younger men, including myself. The ceremony took place in the state of Chihuahua, Chihuahua, Mexico, near the Texas
Chihuahua.
Chihuahua, near Mexico, near the Texas border. It consisted of singing, and of ingesting peyote during the night. In the daytime, women attendants who stayed outside the confines of the ceremony site supplied each man with water, and only a token of ritual food was consumed each day.
Now this is quite fascinating. All right. Now, by the way, this is quite a while back in 1964, and you know, the you know, you will see with Don Juan specifically. Don Juan is absolutely not prejudiced or biased in any way, right? And it just that happened to be the culture of the time. This, you know, male female division here. Um, that, you know, this peyoteros, which is in the, you know, if it was with the O makes it masculine, the A would make, you know, I guess the female would be a peyotera, right? Now, I don't know. Back then, it seemed like maybe the thing was when the men do it, then they do it only. There's no hint here that the women do it separately and then the men attend them. That may be the custom, but I suspect not. Right? Just from a historical point of view, these tend to, well, that's the men do it, but I wonder if it is so today still, because between the 60s and now, things have changed considerably. And I would be very surprised if this is still the case, where it is balanced, where it is divided like this, right? That would be very surprising. So just something to note there, that, you know, from Moreness-Culture, there's none of this in Moreness-Culture. It's just, it's unthinkable in Moreness-Culture. Yeah, it just, why would you make this separation? Yeah, this makes no sense. Right, Beena? That's something that I
Yes.
also want to mention, because we don't take anything for granted, and we want to not take them for granted so that we don't have this inadvertent assumptions that could happen, right? Just because we're reading this and I'm not criticizing it doesn't mean I necessarily condone it either. Yeah, it just, that's how it was back then. Yeah, I don't need to criticize it in order to not have an alternative that I use. Yes, in my world, I people are people, and I don't even think of them as people. I think of them as sentient beings. Yeah, that's it. And sentient beings can take any form. I typically only meet them as human beings, but I have met some sentient animals. Yes, which was a very different experience. I got to tell you. I mean, I wrote about it quite extensively, or in detail, not extensively, but in detail, about a horse person, as that particular horse came to be called. Not a typical horse, right? There was also a dog that we lived with. Fiero was his name, that had a sentience to him that was quite remarkable, right? So we see it in other beings sometimes, yes. Uh, it's less common than in humans, but again, you know, when you pay attention to the massive humanity, you also might say, well, you know, sentience isn't the typical. Yeah. Yes, it seems so, but if you really examine people's lives and look at their motivations, their logic, their awareness, sometimes they, not sometimes, but very often, we'll see people behaving very unsentiently, right? So I don't take sentience for granted in human beings either. It's something we need to work towards. We like to think we're all wonderful in that. But if we actually look at our behavior and the insanity of it, for the most part, it's astonishing. It's astonishing, right? The things that we do, right? And you ask people now, well, why are you doing it? Well, isn't that what everybody does? No, it's not what everybody does. And just because everybody's being stupid doesn't mean you must be stupid, right? All right, please continue, Beena.
Saturday, 12 September 1964. During the first night of the ceremony, Thursday, 3rd September, I took 8 peyote buttons. They had no effect on me, or if they did, it was a very slight one. I kept my eyes closed most of the night. I felt much better that way. I did not fall asleep, nor was I tired. At the very end of the session, the singing became extraordinary. For a brief moment, I felt uplifted and wanted to weep, but as the song ended, the feeling vanished. We all got up and went outside. The woman gave us water. Some of the men gargled it, others drank it. The men did not talk at all, but the woman chatted and giggled all day long. The ritual food was served at midday. It was cooked corn. At sundown on Friday, 4th September, the second session began. The leader sang his peyote song, and the cycle of songs and intake of peyote buttons began once again. It ended in the morning with each man singing his own song in unison with the others. When I went out, I did not see as many women as had been there the day before. Someone gave me water, but I was no longer concerned with my surroundings. I had ingested 8 buttons again, but the effect had been different. It must have been towards the end of the session that the singing was greatly accelerated. With everybody singing in at once, I perceived that something or somebody outside the house wanted to come in. I couldn't tell whether the singing was done to prevent it from bursting in or to lure it inside. I was the only one who did not have a song. They all seemed to look at me questioningly, especially the young man. I grew embarrassed and closed my eyes.
Interesting. Beena, one moment, a second, yeah. I just want to
Yes.
say hello to Nazia, also joined us.
Hello, Nazia.
Nazia Kushbak, yeah. I hope I'm
Nazia
saying that right.
Kushbak.
I think so. Kushbak,
It
yeah.
is like khrief, it is khush, and then it is
Bach.
bakht, the khrief.
Yeah,
like
Kushbak.
bakht.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Bach, Kushbak. Okay.
Good
Very
luck.
good.
Means good luck. Someone having good
Oh,
luck.
wow. Oh, Nazia,
Yes.
good luck. Wow, I like that. Very cool, Nazia. Very cool. And then Joseph makes a comment about the man and the woman. He said, yes, things have changed a lot. However, it is still making an assumption that Don Juan would talk differently now. Don Juan didn't say anything about the men and the woman there, right? I mean, he didn't have any commentary on it whatsoever. So, yes, I do suspect, at least, that this idea that Don Juan would talk differently, this I'm absolutely convinced of and sure of. Why? Because Don Juan understands appropriateness and the evolution of appropriateness, right? And as things evolve, he'll be appropriate, right? He has a very, very deep understanding of appropriateness. Now, he doesn't use this term as I do, and it's a big deal. It's the key, the apex point, philosophical point of the entire A+ philosophy, right? Appropriateness. Everything stems from there. When you understand appropriateness, then everything else follows. In another part, he points to a specific woman, and another part, he points to a specific way women and men are different, says Joseph here. Yes, Joseph, he does say they are different. And of course, there are differences, but the differences don't necessarily mean better or worse. Now, he does say in some ways women have an advantage and in other ways men have an advantage. But this is a recognition of actuality in terms of how those differences make a difference. It doesn't mean that on the overall he's saying men are better than women or women are better than men, right? There's a nuance here to understand that being accurate in terms of what the reality is not the same as discriminating based on an ego idea. If it turns out that in some way that one is better than the other, in an actual realistic way that you can scientifically prove and measure, then Donald will say, well, that's just it, okay, women are better than men, us men, we just have to accept it, and that's just the reality, right? But there would be that realism involved. But I'm pointing to the fact that he isn't discriminatory based on nonsense criteria. He discriminates, yes, because discrimination is a very powerful quality. It's a cousin to discernment, right? To discriminate is to be able to finally distinguish. We need discrimination in many aspects of our lives. If you're going to be in any kind of like law or science or engineering, you don't have the ability to discriminate, and you can't tell the difference between, let's say a 1/16th and a 1/32nd screw. Well, that's discrimination right there, right? It's maybe very obvious to some, but to others not so much. Oh, look the same to me, right? Or with a thread going one way or the other way. Oh, who knows? Metric or imperial. Sometimes they look very much the same, right? But they a tiny fraction off, less than 1/32 and 16th, yeah. And you can. So we need that ability to finally discriminate in practical things. But where discrimination has become a negative word is when we unfairly use criteria to discriminate, right? It's the unfairness, the unreasonableness, the unjustifiedness of that makes discrimination negative, right? Not discrimination itself. It is undue discrimination, right? Bogus discrimination, in other words, right? Prejudicial, unnecessarily prejudicial, right? And it's faulty thinking, in other words. That's the problem. So Don Juan is not given to faulty thinking, yes? And again, he doesn't express any opinion here because he's going and he's partaking in a ceremony where he's not leading the ceremony. He's taking callers to experience the ceremony in that particular cultural settings. He does it himself privately, like the first time they did it, right? It was just even callers. They went out into the desert. It was a whole different experience to this metote, right? Which is a particular thing. It's not part of Don Juan's lineage, tradition, right? But it's a cultural thing. So it overlaps, right? But just to make that point very clear here, that yeah, Don Juan is a very cool guy, and he has good character. For him to be unreasonably prejudicial is just quite unthinkable. As you'll get to see as we get to know Don Juan. Now, we just reading its early days. We've got very little to go on now. But this is what we are doing with our capital R reading. We are applying capital H hearing or capital P perceiving to put together an understanding of Don Juan's character, in addition to Don Juan's beliefs, his cosmology, his ideology, his goals, his motivations, his intents. We also want to know his character. And we can do that, right? I mean, I have a whole massive, great big program which teaches how to do this, right? It's very useful for getting to know yourself. And also, of course, if you want to be like a coach or something, a therapist, whatever, you're working with people, the ability to know others and hear them. This is an incredible thing, right? And that hearing, because this is how you get to really know people, not by what you think, but what they share, right? It's a matter of real depth perception. So we're applying this to getting to know Don Juan, right? Now, I've had much involvement with this, and in terms of, so I bring together my pre-existing depth of involvement with Don Juan, right? There's a lot to it, right? So I will bring from what I know from that will only be revealed later in the book series, and there are 14 books altogether, right? But when you look at matters, not to look at the textual details, right? Which are that sometimes they're important, yes, but like this, the metote, it's not really of interest to me personally, because I'm interested in learning and growing what I can do. I don't have access, at least when I really studied this, which was 40 years ago, uh, I had no access to that whatsoever. So it's just something I skip. And again, later on in the series, Don Juan makes it clear that the power plants, they have a high cost. And the only reason he's using them so often with Carlos is because Carlos is kind of stubborn and in such a bubble, and he needs to crack his worldview in order to collapse his worldview. And Carlos needs extra because he's just so wrapped up in his nonsense, which is kind of cool for us in a way, because we get to see a lot of things that we would not otherwise get to see and understand. All right, we want to continue, please, Beena?
Yes. Okay. Envision other with different.
Yeah, I grew embarrassed and closed my eyes.
So
That's
I
really right.
closed my eyes. Then I
Let me
realized I could
scroll it.
perceive. Okay. Then I realized I could perceive what was going on much better if I kept my eyes closed. This idea held my undivided attention. I closed my eyes and saw the man in front of me. I opened my eyes and the image was unchanged. The surroundings were exactly the same for me, whether my eyes were open or closed. Suddenly, everything vanished or crumbled, and there emerged in its place the man-like figure of Mescalito I had seen 2 years before. He was sitting some distance away from with his profile towards me. I stared fixedly at him, but he did not look at me. Not once did he turn. I believed I was doing something wrong, something that kept him away. I got up and walked towards him to ask him about. But the act of moving dispelled the image. It began to fade, and the figures of the man with, I was asking about, okay, about it. But okay, sorry, I just read it again. But the act of moving dispelled the image. It began to fade, and the figures of the man I was with were superimposed upon it. Again, I heard the loud, frantic singing. I went into the nearby bushes and walked for a while. Everything stood out very clearly. I noticed I was seeing in the darkness, but it mattered very little this time. The important point was, why did Miss Cleto avoid me? I returned to join the group, and as I was about to enter the house, I heard a heavy rumbling and felt a tremor. The ground shook. It was the same noise I had heard in the Beauty Valley 2 years before. I ran into the bushes again. I knew that Mescalito was there and that I was going to find him, but he was not there. I waited until morning and joined the others just before the session ended. The usual procedure was repeated on the third day. I was not tired, but I slept during the afternoon. In the evening of Saturday, 5th September, oh, sorry, just a minute. There is a thunderstorm here. Very
Wow, exciting. We can't hear it, Beena. We can't hear it.
no, but things are just moving. So
yeah, no problem. While you do that, I just want to say thanks to Joseph. I love your perspectives, Joseph. I love hearing it. And it was very nice to hear that things have changed a lot, right? For me, kind of that type of thing, it's accepted by all involved.
I will join again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right. Okay. That arrangement where the men are doing it and the woman, it's not like they forcing or bullying or pressuring the woman. The women are quite happy to do it, right? So it's not a negativity to it. But I am very cautious personally of unintended consequences, particularly the unintended consequences of where we do things and they lead to division, right? And it's just, well, okay, well, that's how it's always been. That's a sort of tradition. But just because it's tradition doesn't make it ideal, optimal, or right. Yes, or appropriate. Yeah. And I'm cautious of this, which is why I pay attention to that and make a point of it. Yes. And I want to also, I was making the point of a deeper discernment that just because it's written in a way that both Carlos Well, at least we don't know Don Juan's opinion here, right? He's just taking Carlos to this thing for his own reasons. He doesn't say boo or bah about it, but at least Carlos doesn't comment on this. He just accepts it, right? And in that acceptance, there might be the implication that he condones this. Now, there may be nothing to not condone. We don't know the full details here, right? Because like I said, it may be that it was flip-flopped. I doubt it, but it may be. So I don't want to presume. I mean, I would say with a fairly high degree of certainty that back in that time, it wasn't flip-flopped. It was just one-sided. But I never assume as 100%. I always keep that percentage in mind because sometimes things will surprise you. Yeah. But you know, when you understand culture and cultural bias and male female, this whole misogyny thing that's inadvertent sometimes and just kind of happens to be, it goes way back into our past, and it's become traditionalized, right, and become culturalized. So I like to point that out so that we have this awareness and maintenance of our attention to not just accept things because they aren't emphasized, right? It's a very casual thing. We could have just skipped over it. It wasn't all that, wasn't the important point of the story. The story was about him joining the Matote and obviously his experience with Mescalito. But I have trained myself to pay attention to the surrounding points, the subsidiary points, the connecting points, the related points, the implied points. Yes. Now, does it imply that Carlos is sexist? Not necessarily. Does it imply that Carlos isn't always paying attention to things like that he lacks a bit of discernment? Yes, absolutely. Because we see this pattern repeated many times where he doesn't grasp the full detail. Yeah. Does it say anything about Don Juan? No, because Don Juan isn't commenting and we're not hearing from Don Juan here at all. And when Don Juan does comment on things, we see his discernment abilities, right? Don Juan possesses tremendous ability to discern. And like I said too, there may be some cultural baggage, but I never saw any of it in Don Juan, right? Like I said, when he points out much later that differences between men and women, it's in a very particular context. So we have to consider it in that context. Yes, he was saying men and women have differences when it comes to particular activities, and these are activities of energy and intent. It would be too much now. We have to build up to that, right? Because otherwise it's going to not have any meaning, the activity himself. It's very complex, and we'll see that. We have to get the preamble before that, the build-up, the layout, right? So it's an important point. I'm making a point, though, just about paying attention and not just letting things pass us by, and to look at the deeper implications. When we learn to look at implications, changes our entire lives. It enhances our lives incredibly. We start to see so much more that we don't otherwise see. It is an incredible power to be able to see and observe and notice and act upon implication, and to train yourself, right? Because implication isn't certainty, but to train yourself to understand when it is that you can take it as almost certain, and when you have to be very cautious of it, right? But implication can be very strong when we train ourselves how to see it. Very powerful stuff. Very, very powerful stuff. Right. All right. Let's continue. The important point was, why did Mescalito avoid me? I returned to join the group. And as I was about to enter the house, I heard a heavy rumbling and felt a tremor. The ground shook. It was the same noise I had heard in the Peyote Valley 2 years before. I ran into the bushes again. I knew that Mescalito was there and that I was going to find him. But he was not there. I waited until morning and joined the others just before the session ended. The usual procedure was repeated on the third day. I was not tired, but I slept during the afternoon. In the evening of Saturday, 5 December, the old man sang his peyote song to start the cycle once more. During this session, I tuned only one button and did not listen to any of the songs, nor did I pay attention to anything that went on. From the first moment, my whole being was uniquely concentrated on one point. I knew something terribly important for my well-being was missing. Ah, very cool. While the men sang, I asked Mescalito in a loud voice to teach me a song. My pleading mingled with the men's loud singing. Immediately, I heard a song in my ears. I turned around and sat with my back to the group and listened. I heard the song and the tune over and over, and I repeated them until I had learned the whole song. It was a long song in Spanish. Then I sang it to the group several times, and soon afterwards a new song came to my ears. By morning, I had sung both songs countless times. I felt I had been renewed, fortified. After the water was given to us, Don Juan gave me a bag, and we all went into the hills. It was a long, strenuous walk to a low mesa. There I saw several peyote plants, but for some reason, I did not want to look at them. After we had crossed the mesa, the group broke up. Don Juan and I walked back, collecting peyote buttons, just as we had done the first time I helped him. We returned in the late afternoon on Sunday, 6 September. In the evening, the leader opened the cycle again. Nobody had said a word, but I knew perfectly well it was the last gathering. This time the old man sang a new song. A sack with fresh peyote buttons was passed around. This was the first time I had tasted a fresh button. It was pulpy, but hard to chew. It resembled a hard green fruit and was sharper and more bitter than the dried buttons. Personally, I found the fresh peyote button infinitely more alive. I chewed 14 buttons. I counted them carefully. I did not finish the last one, for I heard the familiar rumble that marked the presence of Mescalito. Everybody sang frantically, and I knew that Don Juan and everybody else had actually heard the noise. I refused to think that their reaction was a response to a cue given by one of them merely to deceive me. This is superiority paradigm. You're always suspicious of everything. Now, yes, suspicion does have its place, but undue suspicion does not. And this is an outflow, a consequence of the superiority paradigm, this unreasonable suspicion, right? That people would go to extreme lengths just to deceive you. Well, of course, the idea there, the motivation behind it is that I'm so important that people will do it. Yeah, it's just amazing, right? Understanding the superiority paradigm, very, very powerful. Again, I have another profound, really big, extensive course on the superiority paradigm, based on the book that I wrote about it, or books, plural. At that moment, I felt a great surge of wisdom engulfing me. A conjecture I had played with for 3 years turned then into a certainty. It had taken me 3 years to realize, or rather to find out, that whatever is contained in the cactus Lophophori williamsi had nothing to do with me in order to exist as an entity. It existed by itself out there at large. I knew it then. This is a very big revelation for Carlos the academic. Carlos is an academic. And keep in mind, this book 1 was presented, what we're seeing here was presented as his doctoral thesis in anthropology. Yes. And from an academic point of view, magic does not exist. Right? And entities, spirits, beings, entities out there, right? They don't exist. This is just, superstition of unsophisticated people, their beliefs, right? Doesn't exist. Yeah, he comes along and he is saying from a academic scientist point of view that, well, he's going to say why. Later on, he's going to actually share some things that kind of prove the statement of his. Well, at least at this point, it's an assertion and it's a hypothesis. It's not yet a proven theory, but he is going to actually prove it later on. And it's kind of a big deal for him because this blows open his entire world. And it's part of collapsing that world. Because if one such instance of something magical, something supernatural, something other than the usual typical reality we know and prove, right? If only one is shown and proven to exist, it means there can be others also, biological extension, right? Yes, it may be that there's only that one exception, but if there's one, there can be more, right? This is a very, very, very big deal to Carlos's psychology. It is an important crack, and it is the reason why Don Juan brings him to the metote, which is an extended group activity, so that he can see this. At least it's, I say it with quite a lot of certainty that this is one of the reasons that Don Juan brings him there, because I understand Don Juan and his strategy. And he's looking to crack Carlos's worldview. And the fact that he does get to experience this with others, and he sees something which is outside of the norm, outside of his experience, outside of his reality, proven to also be experienced by others. This is a major leveraging point in collapsing Carlos's worldview, right? And Don Juan has that sophistication to do this deliberately, right? Again, it is my assertion that he's doing so. Don Juan doesn't say so specifically. He does say he wants to collapse Carlos's worldview, not in those words, but you'll see he uses different terminology later on. But collapsing the worldview is a much better terminology right now. It's more comprehensible and understanding than the complex terminology that Don Juan uses later, right? And it's very powerful, very cool, very cool. So this where he says, right, that, let me read that sentence again. A conjecture I had played with for 3 years turned then into a certainty. It had taken me 3 years to realize, or rather to find out, that whatever is contained in the cactus Lephorphori williamsi had nothing to do with me in order to exist as an entity. It existed by itself out there at large. I knew it then. In other words, this entity that he's perceiving isn't something that's made up by his mind as a result of the hallucinogenic mixture. It exists independently. Now, we can, at least you can say scientifically, well, if you take a certain drug, it may produce the exact same effect inside your brain. But now he's coming to an awareness, which he doesn't have proof for right yet. But at least this is very clear to him that mescalito exists independently. That's a major shift in Carlos, major shift, right? And this whole idea, it caused a lot of stir in academic circles, right? It's a big deal, right? When you understand academics, you sort of well understand why, right? But a lot of these things come about, right, in academics. So very, very cool. And hello, Fergasso. Fergasso has joined us as well, right? So I hope I'm saying that right. Maybe it's Ferg Sasso. I don't know. But anyway, could be Ferg Sasso. That's kind of cool. Like as in Fergie, you know, short for Fergie, and the last name is Sasso. But it reads as Ferg Sasso. Yeah. All right, very cool. Nice to have you join us. Very cool. Christopher Abbott has joined us as well. Joseph says, it would be interesting to get Beena's perspective, as she's from a more traditional culture than overall America is. Beena is from a very unique culture, Joseph. Just because Beena lives in Pakistan doesn't mean she's part of what we typically perceive as typical Pakistani culture. Her personal environment, in terms of her extended community that she interacts in, is a very sophisticated community that has a Moreness culture, even though they don't think of it that way. But, you know, at least they have elements, a good portion of it, the basics of a Moreness culture. So she lives in a very, very different, her personal individual culture is very, very different, right? Yeah, so it will be interesting to hear her perspective, absolutely. When she comes back, we'll ask her. And then Joseph goes on to say, traditional roles exist as an adult choice today in most places. Yes, exactly. However, it's clear that Don Juan would generally follow them if no other reason than to go against them would bring negative special attention to him. Exactly. Which would make it harder for his intent to be manifested. Exactly. In other words, to sum that up in one word, following the philosophy of appropriateness. It all falls under appropriateness. When we understand appropriateness as a philosophy, it's an entirely different understanding of appropriateness. Now, just to make this clear, When I say appropriateness, I do not mean proper. Many people think the two are synonyms, and in some dictionaries even, they are said as a synonym. But there's a massive difference between appropriate and proper. Appropriate is entirely dependent on context and on motivation, right? I mean, an example I've used many times before. If my motivation, my intent, my goal is to be a hooligan, and I go to a funeral and laugh, yes, and crack jokes when people are all sad and serious, right? That kind of a funeral. You may go to a different, like a wake, and then it would be appropriate. But in a typical traditional Western funeral where everybody's all sad and for me, going and cracking and making fun, that would be to the typical people going to the funeral, that would be grossly inappropriate. However, since I went there with the intent and the goal to be a hooligan and to be disruptive, my behavior is appropriate according to my goals, inappropriate according to theirs. Yes. Now, I take that same behavior, right, and with the same intent, and I go to a wedding and I'm all jovial and happy and cracking jokes. Now I'm being appropriate according to me, but appropriate according to the people. See? So appropriateness is completely and utterly dependent on both context and motivation, right? And those two satisfied. Proper is somebody telling you, you should do this in these conditions. It's somebody's idea that they believe to be appropriate, ultimately appropriate and right and moral and blah, blah. But that's just their particular idea. It doesn't make it necessarily so. And that's the problem with proper. It has turned out to be not appropriate in many cases, right? It turns out to be very inappropriate. But when you get stuck in tradition and idea of should and all this stuff, you end up in a mess, right? Appropriateness has that necessity of in us that we have to have flexibility, fluidity, and adaptability. If you don't have that, then it's very hard to be appropriate because things change, things shift, and you need to shift with it, right? And especially if you're going to learn to live in attunement with the universe, with the world, with life, with everything, with your inner self, with the complexity of how we are. And living in attunement absolutely requires the ability to be appropriate, which requires the ability to be fluid, flexible, and adaptable, right? Very, very key, very key. But yeah, great point. Right? Great point about Don Juan's appropriateness, Joseph. Most excellent, yes. This is one of the reasons I absolutely love Don Juan, right? Is that he has this innate, automatic, and developed ability to be appropriate. He didn't always have it, as we're going to see when we hear Don Juan's story when he first became an apprentice. We'll see him behave inappropriately, yes, and his awareness of it. And this term, though, this term appropriateness as a philosophy, it fascinates me that in all, and I've made a point, I've mentioned this before, but for those who don't know, back in my youth, right, after I developed my own personal philosophy, I was so focused on learning and growing, I read all of the classics in chronological order. In chronological order, it makes a very big difference, not just here, there, and everywhere, right? So I saw the development and growth of awareness, of thinking, of beliefs, of ideas, of ideology, theology, etc. You see, there's a pattern, there's a progress. But that's another long story. At any rate, in all of that, nowhere, not once, does not one single individual, and I read all of the classics in philosophy, in religion, in literature, even economics, whatever I could find that was regarded as a classic. Nowhere, not in the Bible, not in the Quran, not in the Bhagavad Gita, nowhere is this term appropriateness used as a term, right? As a concept, right? It's not, doesn't exist. It's fascinating to me, right? Absolutely fascinating how this is missing from our philosophical, psychological understanding. Once we cotton onto this and click, oh, all I need is appropriateness and understanding of appropriateness. And from there, I can figure everything else out. It's an incredible thing. It's the first chapter of the big book series that I have, right? The chapter is called Just One Word, right? And that's it. That's all you need. It's just this one word, right? And when we really understand this, now I get people, they don't quite understand appropriateness. And so that, yeah, but it's all about context. Something can be appropriate in a limited bubble context, like in this case. it's appropriate for both Carlos and Don Juan not to have anything to say about this separation of roles between men and women, because they have an agenda, they have an intent, and that's not their business. It's the people themselves' business. They're not there to teach them and change their ways. They're there to partake in their ways, right? And they're not there to judge the people. So it's not appropriate for them to say anything about it, right? But again, in the context of the book, Carlos can make a point that, well, he doesn't much care for that, right? Because, well, it's a bit, that's his personal opinion, right? So he can make this distinction that he's not necessarily condoning something. Right? But you might say, well, I have no basis to know, so I can't say anything about it. He doesn't go to that level of discernment because it's not part of his thing, but it is part of mine, right? It's part of Moreness-Culture to share that level of discernment. But appropriateness is absolutely key here. And so you make a great point there, and it's very cool to point it out. Don Juan is fantastically appropriate. And we're going to get to this later on when we start to talk about strategy, right? And this is a very, very big point, particularly in terms of a whole way of being, a paradigm that Don Juan uses. There's a couple of them, right? 3 major ones. And one of those paradigms of being takes strategy very much into account. And appropriateness there is absolutely key to understand. And we'll see it. We'll see specific examples of what may be inappropriate in a typical context is appropriate in that specific context and with a specific agenda. So there is a definite, very clear and sophisticated depth, discerning understanding of appropriateness by Don Juan, right? Yeah, so Beena hasn't rejoined us, but we'll read a little more and hope she comes, and I'll ask her about this. Yeah, just Joseph, I know from many discussions that Beena doesn't have any of the typical male-female, what we would assume, right? And what we assume of the culture in Pakistan in general is somewhat of a misassumption, as Beena has explained before. We've gone into this topic quite a few times, but it's quite enlightening. Like when she was telling the story about when she went to the gym, right? I think there's a clip somewhere from Abayas to Lululemon, right? You can maybe search in group, it'll come up, or on my YouTube channel, right? If you search from Abayas to Lululemon, very cool little clip, which Beena explains when she went to the gym. Now, Beena lives in a wonderful culture, and she grew up somewhat sheltered because Beena is at least she was, a profound innocent in the world. And people tend to protect innocence, innocence, with a T at the end, not innocence, N-E-S-C-E, right? In other words, people who are innocent, right? And as such, she grew up very pure, right? Without any undue biases and nonsense, which is a fantastic thing, right? It's a very wonderful thing that her not only her family, but the greater community which exists did, right? And as a result, so she's sophisticated in a great number of ways, but lacked some kind of real world experience, because that real world experience, they protected her from it, because it's not always the most ideal. I remember a friend of hers took her to essentially a nightclub, and this guy Beena told me the story, and this guy was hitting on Beena, and she had no clue that he was hitting on her. And he just gave up in frustration, and it was the most hilarious story ever. It was just fantastic. But see, innocence has its own protection. I mean, he was being undue. He was, a friend went with her and kind of abandoned her, and she was just there all on her own, and she was a bit vulnerable. Right? And he was a predator, right? Absolute predator, looking to take advantage of Beena. But because she was not in a space where all his innuendo and suggestivity and clues and all of this, it just bounced. It just fell flat. And the guy left like, oh, what kind of an idiot is this? It's not an idiot. Beena's not an idiot at all. Certainly not. But that innocence protected her. Anyway, and of course, those that environment or culture are aware of this. Now, they didn't quite intend for a friend to take her to the nightclub. That was sort of, but an unusual thing. But in the same way that she didn't have that kind of experience in the world. And that kind of experience where, women who know what that guy's about, the reason they have that is because they've had negative experiences of that before. right? It's not a fun way to learn about that, right? And it changes your perspective on the world, right? And it doesn't make you necessarily, at least from a woman's point of view, it reduces your positivity about men in general. Because unfortunately, you know, and I grew up in a household of women, yes, and most of my friends are women. So I have a very, very deep connection to this awareness. How, you know, they don't always share it with men, but and they sort of forgive men in general the behavior of those jackasses. But that jackass behavior is a lot more common than most men who are nice guys who don't do that than they believe. It's sadly almost every woman you know has had such experiences. Yes, it's quite frightening. So this is a sensitive topic and it's a big deal topic and not one that one can just sort of, you know, not pay attention to. But the point I want to make is that about our traditional perception of Pakistan and the culture there. It's not what we think. There's a moreness to it. Like when Beena went to the gym, right? And the women are coming, and many of them had the abayas on, as they call it there, right? Or burqas is known in other parts of the world, but there they call them abayas, right? The whole outfit. And she was saying that, you know, when they came into the locker room and they took this off, underneath they had on like, I don't know, Lululemon and stuff like that, clothing and outfit and jewelry and stuff that Beena said she didn't even know that was easily available in Pakistan. But of course, they found a way to get it, right? And so what was underneath the abaya was completely at odds with the external. But in the cultural setting, the woman would have been inappropriate to, in the general perception of culture. And the reality and the perception, two different things. Those women, to be out in public with that, they would not like to do it because that's something that way of dressing and being was something for them which was private for them and their husbands. Okay, you can share it with other women, but certainly not the general public, right? And they were very sophisticated, these women, right? And Beena was saying there's a great advantage to that abaya. You don't have to bother with your hair. And like in this case, I didn't have to put on a traveling outfit and then change into my gym clothes. I could just have my gym clothes on right away, or the Lululemon, which, you know, most women, even in America, they don't necessarily wear your gym clothes out in public, right? It's different outfits. So it gave them this great freedom to be anonymous. And something that came to me in a very peculiar way when I was a teenager. I came to understand that true power lies in anonymity. That was the quote that came from it, the self-quote from myself. Right? And it was something that when it came up in me, it was a great certainty. But I didn't have the backing to understand why I felt so certain about it. But that was my nature. I didn't just accept things, even though they came from myself, because that to me was always arrogant. I had to know why. And it took me many, many years, decades even, to fully unravel the power of that self-statement. And these women have that, right? So again, there's, at least in Beena's world, she is treated with the utmost of respect and care. There's no undue discrimination of any kind, right? No discrimination. I say undue because I don't like to use the word discrimination as a substitute for negativity, right? It's undue discrimination that's the problem, not discrimination itself, right? Like I said before, we need to be discriminating when it comes to the word discriminate. Yes, we have to discriminate when it comes to discrimination. That's very important. So Beena has a fantastic environment, and really, I mean, she could not live in an environment where she has more respect. Yeah, she lives in Moreness-Culture, at least in the basics of it is there, right? She lives in a very magical, very profound culture, very awesome. You know, respect is primary of everything. Yes, yeah, and respect for difference, of course, not just respect for difference, but also celebration of difference. Yeah, and yes, they are traditional roles, but that doesn't mean that you have to be that. Yeah, I mean, we are now in the throes politically of getting all excited about again potential of having the first female president of the United States. And it's such a big deal here. When, you know, if you're only in America, and you don't have history, world history as part of your makeup, which a lot of people do, and it's never connect to world history. You might think that America is going to be the first country in the world to have a female leader. No, no. Many other countries have had them long time ago, right? Including Pakistan. Including Pakistan. The state in which Beena lives, or province, right, as a governor, female governor. Right? So this is, again, we have this view of Pakistan, but it's a media biased view. Yes. And we have to be very careful, because that bias is something that comes about for reasons other than reality. I grew up in South Africa, yeah, and I grew up during the apartheid years. And I heard a lot of things about the reality. Now, when you live there and you experience the reality, yes, it was not cool, but it didn't make every white South African a racist. It's not even close. No, why? Because the party that got into power came into power as a minority vote, right? Not the majority of people did them, but they were able to, through gerrymandering, rig the whole election process. Once they came in power, they used the church to push their message, and right, they put a great pressure on the church, and through that, the church is a very powerful point there. So people bought into this, supporting the government, because this was, according to your church and your minister, telling you to do this. It's the right thing to do. And because they are very religious and trying to be good and do the right thing, they did what they were told to do. Yeah, because that's part of the religion, is being obedient. Yeah, like this one fellow, I had a big discussion about racism. He says, yeah, but you grew up in a racist culture. You were taught to be superior. I said, I didn't have anything of that whatsoever. I had quite the opposite, actually. The culture I grew up in was an obedience culture. I was taught to be obedient. Now, did I always subscribe to that? Yes, on the surface, externally, but internally I said, hell no, all this stuff is a bunch of nonsense. Right? I had a private self and a social self. Very, very fundamental, profound psychological technique of appropriateness. Very incredible. And anyway, that's a long story too. But I'm making the point that on the ground, the actual people on the majority were not racist. Yes, there certainly is a minority that was very racist, but that's in all over the world. Every single country in the world has this. No? It just happened to be that those knuckleheads, those fools, came into power and found a way to stay in power for a very long time. And the proof that I have to say this, that the majority of white South Africans are not racist, is because the majority of white South Africans voted to hand over power to the black majority, or the non-white majority. Black is a term, American thing. In South Africa, it's much more complex than that, right? As you got other ethnicities involved as well beside that. So a very complex demographic situation in South Africa. But anyway, they voted to hand over power to a non-white majority. The only country in the world that I know of, ever, in its history, where a minority has deliberately said, we will hand over power to somebody else who's a greater majority than us. Yeah, I think in 1966, when blacks in America got the vote, yeah, if the ratios had been different at that point, what was 90% white, 10% black, more or less, right? Yes, there was Asian and then Hispanic, but there was smaller percentages then. They've grown significantly since then. But that was the basic understanding, 90-10. In South Africa, it was reversed. It was 10% white, 90% non-white. Yeah. Now, if in America, it had been 10% white, 90% non-white. In 1966, if you understand American history and culture, I'm fairly confident that I can say there's no way that that vote would have been handed over. Or at least that blacks would have been given the vote in America if the percentages had been reversed. No way. Sorry. Yeah. So this just, I'm making a point though. And the bigger point was, when I grew up in the media, right, international media, South Africa was the worst. Everybody's a racist. Everybody's terrible. Why was it? I saw this disproportionate exaggeration and stuff really out of context. Yes, of course, from a legal point of view, but there was no discernment into the realness, and none. Right? South Africa was just this horrible thing. Why this focus? And when I came to America, I understood. Because there's the guilty conscience here. And when you're saying somebody else is bad, it takes away the tension from you and your own nonsense. Right? I have experienced way more racism here than I ever did in South Africa. Yes, occasionally, I would go to a farm, for instance, like in the cities, never did I see this. All right. But in the country, you had people like, particularly that you find them still today, that are super racist, like the people that are the neo-Nazis or whatever. And you own a farm and you got, or a business, and you got laborers and people working for, and they would abuse them for racist reasons. Right? I saw that occasionally, but it was occasional. It was occasional. It was exceptional. And I went to a great many such places, right? I traveled extensively in South Africa. I spent a lot of time in such places. So it's not like I didn't have a lot of experience. No, not a lot, right? And, even in the military, I was in the South African military in the early 80s, right? In the heart of it. I worked in the boot camp, right? In the army infantry camp, right? My job, I was the garbage truck driver. My superior was a black guy. So if you really look at things a little bit more carefully, you start to see, a little bit different, right? The reality and the legality were two different things. And that's why the whole system collapsed eventually. Because the people came to realize, they became aware, they were in a bubble, belief bubble. And when that bubble popped and they realized that, hey, here's other reality, it changed, right? But I want to make the point is that we have to be careful of the media. They distort things because of other reasons, right? You feed people what they want to see, what you personally want to know. And this guilty conscience, especially from an American point of view, right? The racism, it's still around today even, right? Where, even when I'd left, it was already not an issue. Yeah, it already was starting to fade. The issues that America is still struggling with were already starting to when I left in '92, already then on the way out, right? So it's fascinating when we look at the media and how they distort things and why they distort things. So this, again, if you want to understand Beena's perspective, I would absolutely recommend, Joseph, you actually go to Pakistan. It will be an eye-opening revelation. Eye-opening revelation. The culture there is so different to what is portrayed on TV and in the media. Very different. Of course, there are elements of it. There's elements of misogyny and racism and abuse. There's everywhere. But is it pervasive? No. No. The media tends to focus on the exception, not on the habit. That's the job of the media. When there's some calamity, it's the exception. We don't focus via the media on every day that things are good. You don't get a news report that says, wow, today there was no major disaster anywhere. Or at least the percentage is much lower. And it says, well, today this happened that was good. This happened, this was good. All the good things that are boring, they don't ever mention this, right? So we have to be very careful of the distortion of the media. The media exists to point out exception, not the norm. And the norm is not defined by the exception, right? Very important to be aware of. Very important to be aware of. And again, too, Pakistan, and in terms of those, there's a specific name for it, where young men go and they kind of train to be terrorists. Yeah? This is a very, very exceptional thing. And Beena pointed out something that I've never heard in the media. The recruitment of those young men are almost exclusively from the lost, like homeless and people, orphans and stuff like that, right? But some orphans get integrated into society, but many of them just become completely lost and they're very vulnerable. And of course, this is happening in America also, like in the neo-Nazi organizations. There's fantastic evidence and sharing of people who've gotten out of it. Like this one guy especially, is very sophisticated in his sharing. He said, when I was a teenager, I was completely lost. And these guys showed me some, they said, you're part of a group. Right? And they just made me feel like I belonged somewhere. Well, I never had that in all my life. And this was the biggest thing ever. I just went along with whatever they did. I wasn't even aware of how negative it was, because all I was focused on was belonging, fitting in. Yes, that was my only intent. So we have to be aware that that same mechanism that exists in Pakistan, that trains the terrorists, it exists here also. Well, not just in Pakistan, but other countries too. It exists here in America also. Yeah? Same thing. Private communities out in the middle of nowhere, isolated, recruiting the lost and the vulnerable. Yeah, it exists here also. There's always idiots in every part of the world. In some parts of the world, and they cause trouble, right? We just don't see it necessarily, but they do it here too. All right. On that note, I will end it, because I suspect that something happened there in Beena. There's lots of political turmoil, and the good guys are sort of making an effort to not let the bad guys get back into power again, because that has happened, and it's a long history of it, unfortunately, in Pakistan, right? Like it was in South Africa for the longest time. And then, of course, with the big change in government, you had corrupt individuals getting into power again, very sadly, right? Part of that thing. I mean, just, I think not the previous president, big scandal, corruption, all this stuff, right? So it happens. It happens, unfortunately. Look at in America, we struggle with this constantly, right? Also, it's something that's part of the deal. Look at Nixon; he was a very corrupt president, right? And we have to be aware that it exists in all parts of the world. It's a constant struggle, right? And it's not just, we like to see things through rose-colored glasses sometimes, but we have to be careful of that. Look at the reality. Look at the reality. Yeah? What actually happens, not what you'd like to believe happens. So very cool, very cool. But I'll leave it here for today. Oh, I was saying, and this trouble where things are looking to try and get sorted, as a result, those that are followers of the corrupt people, they're looking to really stir up a lot of trouble. So as a result, the good guys who are saying, no, we're going to give, when there's potentially, like somebody got arrested and they're going to have the court case, they cut off mobile access, because through the mobile phones, this is how the people organize negative activity against the good things that are happening. Not that they're trying to suppress free speech and all this. It's just a way of preventing negativity from happening. All right, you could argue against it and make a good argument, but it's an effective management technique for not giving power to the knuckleheads. Now, of course, it can be reversed used as well, so it has problems both ways. But that's what's happening right now. So a lot of times when Beena drops off, it's because they are limiting either internet access or phone access. And it's quite fascinating, the whole nuanced appropriateness of it all. Like I say, it's appropriate when the good guys do it, but of course, when the bad guys do it, it's not. Anyway, it's complex morality, but interesting to observe from the outside. But that's likely why Beena isn't back, right? Because of that. There's complications with internet and phone usage. All right, we'll continue tomorrow. Most cool. Most cool. Thank you, Joseph, as always. I love your comments, man. Always add so much. And thank you to everybody on Instagram for joining us. Very cool. Very cool. By the way, Instagram, they don't allow me to share the long video anymore, the entire transcript. So I share clips from it to IG. But if you want to, if you're only maybe catching the tail end, or you want to see previous episodes, right, start from the beginning, maybe see the whole reading of the whole book, from the beginning of it, you can find all of the full-length videos. This is part 25 now that we're on. They're all on YouTube, right? All on my YouTube channel. And in my clips, it'll give you my YouTube name there, at Syl Sabastian. I forget what the number is a number. But you can just search me, Syl Sabastian, with my spelling, and you'll find me. All right. Thank you very, very much, everybody. And we'll see you all tomorrow. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you again, Joseph. And live.